What's up, guys? So today we have a podcast with Scott Stevenson. He has been on the podcast before. We ended up going for a long time, actually close to 3 hours, and we kind of were all over the place with topics. A lot of really great topics, a lot of discussions that I think you guys would enjoy. I'm just mentioning it here because it's actually going to be broken up into 3 separate podcasts. I think 3 hours is a little bit long, and breaking it up into maybe 45 to 1 hour podcast is going to be more digestible for you. So we talk about DC training, we talk about fortitude training, we talk about training to failure, we talk about different training studies. We talk about some of my individual training and how I might be doing DC training in the future and how I should actually individually structure it. We talk about peri-workout nutrition and how somebody might want to structure their routine and their nutrition if they're having issues getting in enough food. We talk about supplements. We talk about a lot here. So I really hope you guys enjoy the first installment today and look out for installments number 2 and 3 coming up. Also, it greatly helps the channel if you can hit that thumbs up button, if you can subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anybody who you think might enjoy it. So again, hope you guys enjoy. Just genetic and stuff, but
that's it. I mean,
yeah.
If you look at the range, everything I've looked into, where you see like the studies, and we can talk about this, has been a topic that I've covered a good bit, and there's some interesting training related stuff too that we can dig into. You find such a range from non-responsiveness to extreme responsiveness.
Yeah,
it's just all over the place, and that's true for drugs. You know, it's true of everything. Like there's I don't know if you brought up placebo before, and maybe we talked about it last time I was on here. I can't recall, but there's some really interesting work being done now on isolating the SNPs, the polymorphisms involved with the genes that tend to predispose people for placebo effect. And in many cases, I think it was something like 23 out of the 31 genes that have been isolated in this particular review paper that I have. Those genes were also the targets of drugs.
really,
as well. Yeah. So, like catecholomethyltransferase (COMT) is responsible for breaking down dopamine. So those people who have a slower dopamine release tend to have more dopamine around, which leads to excited state, and that's connected with having a placebo effect. Well, you can actually there's a particular drug, I forget the name of it, and there's a couple supplements. What's the supplement? I think I want to say vitamin E, but there's actually supplements that will impair the activity or reduce the activity, inhibit the activity of COMT. So you could give with whatever, if you find out that people are prone to have a placebo effect because of their genetics, there's the SNPs that they have, you can co-administer a drug to impact those gene products in a way that would increase the placebo effect in addition to the drug that you're using to treat whatever disease or whatever issue they have. So if you might get so then you get a double whammy. They not only do they see potentially that the drug has its desired impact, but you've also increased the placebo effect, so they become even more aware of that, and the placebo effect has its impact. Even if the drug doesn't do shit for them, you can get a placebo effect purely from that. So that's smart medicine.
If like susceptibility to the placebo effect has to do with skepticism at all, or if it's just like unrelated, because I find myself extremely skeptical to almost everything, and I don't know, how valid this is, but when I did that 23andMe testing and I ran it through Promethease, it did say less likely to be susceptible to placebo effect. And I've also never really felt like supplements did anything for me. Like I just kind of always felt like stuff just didn't work for me. I just wonder if that's part of it.
Yeah, I mean, and what I haven't seen is people looking into the reverse of that, where you're such your doubting Thomas that your genetics predispose you to overlook or to basically have a reverse placebo effect on whatever might be possibly happening.
I was worried about that too, actually, for people who, like you said, the opposite of it, where somebody is so convinced. So my understanding, is like, because I guess intuitively, I think of, placebo effect is you have something that's inert, and I mean, like oftentimes you can give something that's inert and you still get the response. To me, I think of nocebo being the opposite. But in reality, isn't nocebo actually just when you get a placebo effect, but in a negative? So you get a negative, like a side effect, for instance, that would be like a nocebo, right?
I guess you could say if you fail to experience a beneficial response, that's a negative effect, right? But yeah, in a strictest sense, a nocebo. This is from Science Daily, and they have some reference terms. Actually, they're just pulling from Wikipedia. It looks like, but nocebo response to where drug trial subject symptoms are worsened by the administration of an inert, sham, or dummy simulator treatment called a placebo. So that's kind of a negative effect. But I would, for the purpose of just discussing it, it seems possible, of course, that if you just don't get the desired effect, and maybe the nocebo, and this is, how do you split this out, right? Unless you give some drug to like cancel whatever is going on biologically that would bring about the nocebo.
Yeah.
So you kind of separate them biologically. But if your nocebo is such that it's the negative that cancels out whatever the positive would be instead drug effect, then that's still a nocebo.
Right.
You don't get a negative side effect per se that's measurable, but the lack of the positive benefit, is happening in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
So
it's all really fascinating, just like how much the mind plays a role in it all.
Yeah, I always talk about this study that, and I can send you this one if the listeners want to find it. Let me get you back on the main screen here, where it was published in the Journal of Applied Physiology in like '69. The authors were Kai and Steinhaus, and they were looking at the psychological impact of disinhibition on expression of human strength, something like that. They did a bunch of shit, and have you heard me talk about this? Maybe I brought it up a few times.
I'm not sure. This isn't the classic like steroid placebo one.
No, this is a different one. This is a different one. So this was a pretty cool. So they just had their subjects were just pulling out an isometric dynamometer, and they just wanted to see how strong they were. Give them a max effort. They familiarized them a little bit, and then they got some of them drunk. They did this. We used to call it the screamer in high school, where you just run up and scream at somebody and like watch them kind of shit their pants.
Yeah.
They would, unbeknownst to them, they would have someone scream at them and watch what happened to the blip in strength. They had a starter pistol that they would shoot off next to their head to scare them, and you get an increase in strength. They gave them methamphetamines and an alcohol too, and I think there was one other drug treatment. I think I'm forgetting what it was, but the other interesting treatment was hypnosis.
Yeah, I was gonna say I've heard of hypnosis for this.
Yeah, and they got an effect. They didn't have much an effect on one of their highly trained strength athletes. And in their method section, to document that the hypnosis was actually happening, they took their subject that was that the hypnotist thought was least amenable to the effects of hypnosis. And under hypnosis, and this is in the Journal of Applied Physiology. This is not just this isn't some obscure journal that came and went. It's been around for a long time. It's a high impact journal to this day. And the documentation was under the impact of hypnosis. They told him that he would be touching a hot poker to his hand, and actually it was just a pen.
Yeah.
And when they did that, he had a blistering that happened afterwards.
Right. I had heard of that. Yeah.
And maybe it was me. I've got an article on Elite FTS where I covered.
I think it was in Psycho-Cybernetics, if you're familiar with that book.
I have heard of the book.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I didn't know. I'd never heard anyone else talk about it. But the thing is, what in the hell is the mechanism for that?
Right.
Like, there was no physical damage to the tissue. There was no burn. There was no heat. There's nothing to cause any of those things that brought about the blistering. To me, that's along a continuum of someone just being hypnotized and being told they could fly, and all of a sudden they sprout wings.
Right.
Where does that come from? Like, biologically, there's nothing involved with triggering that local inflammatory response. And the blistering itself,
yeah.
Some of that you normally would attribute simply to the damaging effect of the heat and the hot poker, but there was no such thing in place. They just imagine that shit.
Yeah.
So that's not the type of thing you see people doing, like in circus acts or what have you. But it was documented, so I always thought that was pretty fascinating.
It's interesting though. You said that they didn't see a lot of strength gain in the well-trained subject.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that a lot of this is people, they haven't learned how to push themselves. Whereas like an athlete, it's just we spend years and years. So unfortunately for all of us who have lifted for many years, it's probably not that we can hypnotize ourselves to add 50 pounds to our bench press or anything like that.
This guy was, I think he said he's a world-class, either maybe they just call him a weightlifter, so I guess Olympic weightlifter, but they said, I'm pretty sure they used elite or world-class to describe him. So, many of the people listening are not elite or world-class.
Right, sure.
And I guess you can ask yourself, like a example many people are going to know about is Jordan Peters.
Mm-hmm.
He posts videos of him just going to town on stuff.
Yeah.
And you can ask yourself, whether or not you have those behavioral mannerisms of, screaming and yelling or whatever it is, the things that Jordan does to psych himself up. Do you really push like your life depends upon it?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a gun to your head, all the things people say. Are you really doing that?
Right.
Because the people who are elite, especially in strength and power type things, take a look at World's Strongest. Like Bill Kazmaier is my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
To watch him back in the day, you could see like this, like what would the switch would flip.
Yeah.
And you're like, that guy's an unstoppable force.
Uh-huh.
And he was unbelievably dominant. And I just heard somewhere in a documentary someplace, or maybe he was talking about it. He was not invited back. Like he stopped doing World's Strongest Man competition because they didn't want him there anymore because he was
Really?
kicking everyone's ass.
Actually, I did hear about that. Yeah, I knew that.
Yeah, so he was really that, but that's the type of thing people can say. So how does my mental focus compare to what those guys are doing? And I do that every single day when I go in and want to have an all-out training event.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, almost like a tangential topic. I had Dr. Brad Schoenfeld on maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and something we talked about is I said, do you have anything in the literature that, despite the literature saying this, like maybe you believe this? And he said the failure training. And I said, we got guys like John Meadows, we got Scott Stevenson, these guys who really, Dante, who have been doing this a long time, and they really advocate and they really believe that they see some noticeable changes when they push to failure, even beyond failure, right? I know with your pump sets, you're doing all this crazy stuff, and even, most of your sets, like even like the MRs, they will still have one failure point in there,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whereas we have all this literature saying, well, two RIR is plenty, and so obviously one of the major issues is how trained are these people in the subject studies. Like sometimes they're fairly trained, but not always. But he said that he actually does question the literature on that, and he does think there's probably some benefit to going to failure. And like you said, Jordan Peters, a lot of these guys do. And, I like to really be scientific and follow the evidence, but it is hard for me to ignore when like all of these people are suggesting some failure training. So I don't know if you can maybe touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, if there's a meta-analysis and you can see the forest plot, showing failure versus non-failure, and it doesn't, like as Brad said, and he may have even been part of that particular meta-analysis. To be honest, I think he's one of the authors there. I'm not sure, but that's my guess. And you have to look at the experience level of those individuals. It's external validity, and I always harp on this.
Yeah.
So if those are newbies, of course, you've got a different scenario than someone who's been training for 5, 6, or 7 years. Yeah. And I did a podcast recently, and we talked about this topic a good bit. And afterwards, I sort of reframed in my mind maybe an easier way to think about what this means in terms of as someone is progressing from being a beginner to being very advanced and trying to eke out gains as they sort of near that ceiling where you have the law of diminishing returns applying more and more and more. Mm-hmm. So people always talk about effective reps, right? So it's 5, this magic number, it's 5. Yeah. And that, of course, doesn't make a lot. If you're doing a 10 rep max and you're doing all your sets and stopping at 6, all right, you got one, like all you got to do is 5 sets. And there's a Goto has done a study like that where they just accumulated volume with very easy sets. Okay. And you didn't get any muscle growth. Mm. You just can't. You
How
can't
easy
do that.
Was easy?
I'd have to go look. It was something like that, like doing sets of 5 with 10 rep max, something along that. So maybe just shy of what we might now call effective reps. Right. But you just can't accumulate the volume. So there's obviously too easy. But then you've got increased sensitivity to any stimulus. When you're untrained, that's the time when you can harness the golden fleece, right, and gain muscle and lose fat at the same time. So that can be done. That's done. There are studies from back in like the 50s and 60s. They just take college students and they put them on a jogging program, and then they do hydrostatic weighing and they gain fat-free mass and lose fat. Right. They're just going out and jogging. Right. So it doesn't take much when you're untrained. But if you think about this simply in the context of effective reps, and tell me if this makes sense to you, that to me is a very simple thing. If you just consider that the number of the effective reps is going to be a function of your training experience and to what extent you're nearing your quote unquote genetic limit, or whatever your limit is based on the things you're willing to do in terms of food intake or maybe drug use. Mm-hmm. So if when you're starting off and you make gains much more easily, you may be able to do sets of 11 or 12 with the 15 rep max, and you're accumulating effective reps. So, but as you gain more and more muscle mass, something about that stimulus needs to be stronger. Let's say there has to be something about it in order that's going to prompt those greater gains, and that's where progressive overload would come in.
Right.
That you're continually challenging as you make adaptations. So you obviously can't keep using the same weight, year after year. As you get stronger, you have to keep on training harder and harder. But I think in addition to training, let's say you continue to train with your doing 12 reps with your 15 rep max,
right?
And you adapt, and that 15 rep max goes from 185 to 225 to 275 to 315. If you still do 12 reps with the 15 rep max, and you're much more advanced, and now you're using 315, you've got, I think this is my way of sort of conceptualizing this that makes sense given what Dante and Jordan and I think Brad was sort of suggesting too, is that not only is that you have to maintain the effort relative to what your current capabilities are, but you're going to have to up the ante in some other way. And a way to think about that is that the number of effective reps you get from a particular set is going to be less.
Right.
So if you keep doing sets of 12 and leaving 3 in the tank, you may have 0 effective reps. And that's kind of what Jordan did. You probably followed when he had that interview on Steve Hall's Revive Stronger podcast with Mike Israetel.
A little while back, right?
Yeah, it's been over a year or so now.
Yeah.
But Mike was talking about accumulating volume, using his basic training principles. And Jordan took that on and did that for a while. So he was doing multiple sets, leaving things in the tank, and it didn't work for him.
Yeah.
It didn't happen. And if you want to conceptualize this with the effective reps notion, which I think is a good one, really, leaving 2 or 3 reps in the tank for someone who's advanced as Jordan, I mean, those sets may have been accumulating 0 effective reps.
Right. Yeah,
he was getting nothing in terms of a stimulus. Even so, you could do, if he did, for instance, 1 set of 15 with a 15 rep max, so 0 reps in reserve, or even he brought it to failure, failed in the 16th. That might give him a stimulus. But if he were to do, and this is just theoretical, hypothetical, but if you were to do 6 sets of 12, he might get nothing in terms of effective stimulus from that, because none of those reps were truly the effective ones that challenged his system in a way that would evoke an adaptation.
Right.
So, but on the other hand, you've also got a recovery issue. So he incurred some inroads because he did all those sets, and for him, like, that weight's going to be pretty tremendous.
Sure.
The nervous system still has to handle all of that and deal with all that. I mean, you know what it's like when you put a new heavy weight on your back, or it's like and it's just like, Jesus.
Yeah.
Like I got whacked just from holding the bar there before I did a single rep, right?
Right.
So you incur inroads without getting any true stimulus for growth. If you're leaving too much in the tank, the more advanced you get, because the window at the end of your set for getting effective reps, I think, shortens, and it even shortens relative to your current capacity. So leaving 3 in the tank may give you zilch. You may have to go leave maybe 1 in the tank, or 2 in the tank, or maybe none, or even go to failure.
What I find so interesting about that, and it's tough because I've felt myself become so much part of the evidence-based, crew, whatever, over the years, even before the podcast. Like, that's just like the people I really followed, and I always want evidence for things, right? Like, show me the studies.
Right.
But I think it can be interesting to speculate about certain things, and here we're talking about, okay, so within a session, right, or within a set, you're saying you need to get closer to failure as you're more advanced, right, to create that stimulus. And a lot of people would agree with that. Other people, like Mike Israetel, would say that, he still cycles through 4 RIR up to, eventually 0 RIR. But what I think is interesting is I've heard some people speculate that, if you look at frequency, people talk about up to a certain point is better. And some people will even take that extreme and say, oh, 6, full body workouts a week. But I have some friends who are, fairly advanced with lifting say that they believe you need a certain stimulus per session. Now, I've not seen much to indicate that, but, because I've seen studies where they do low volume, and even people who do low volume every single day. They might do 2 sets every single day, and it seems to work okay. But this, 1 or 2 individuals I'm thinking in particular, they're talking about how you have to have a certain amount of sets or stimulation per workout. Now, referencing back to Dante, if anybody's, I'm sure some people are familiar with DC training here, he starts off with basically a frequency of 1.5 times to 2 times per week, right? Depending on if you're working 3 or 4 times a week.
Mm-hmm.
And you're only doing 1 exercise per muscle group per workout.
Right.
Then, if you go to look at his advanced routines,
with the rest pause sets in many
correct,
cases.
Yes, they're rest pause.
With the pulses afterwards. So
I'm not trying to say it's minimal. I'm just.
But 4 failure points.
Correct.
Kind of important, yeah. So not just 1 straight set. So anyway, that's
that is important.
Following, yeah.
But basically, you pick that 1 exercise, so maybe for people who don't know, just real quick, it might be an example, might be okay. Incline Smith bench is your chest exercise. So you go to failure hitting 10, and then you rest for 10 to 15 breaths, and you go to failure, hit another 4, take another 10 to 15 breaths, and then maybe you get like another 2. And then obviously the next week you try to beat the log book.
And then you would do partials as well with that.
Or always? I thought
that's the typical way to do it. Yeah, couple things there. One, and it can be kind of important. You want to start on a negative,
mm-hmm.
and always for each of those. So if you do down 1 rep, 2 reps, 3 reps, and then you fail, you bring it down on a negative. You always finish with that negative.
Yeah.
The negatives seem to be more important for growth, and those are also the more damaging.
Right.
So, like, let's say you just did 1 rep. You did a negative, and then a rep, and then a negative, and then so you got 2 negatives there, as opposed to if you started here, you do 1 rep, and then you just racked it because you couldn't get another.
Right.
That's a big difference actually in those. So, and then the pulses can be up to. You're trying to hold the weight for 30 seconds doing partials.
Are you separating that from the stretches, like the intense stretches?
Yeah, that's a typical DC thing. Is you would do those pulses or partials afterwards. So rest another 10, 15 breaths. And then you would start at the beginning. Let's say if it's an incline press like that, you would start and go down. Different ways you can do it. It kind of depends on what the exercise lends itself to. But you go down to where you feel the chest really well, and then just try to do partials or pulses, and try to keep. You never hold it for 30 seconds. I don't think I've ever done it once where I could hold it for 30 seconds.
Right.
But you're trying to go at least 30 seconds until either you just, for safety reasons, need to rack it, or you just get to the bottom of the range of motion, and then you just would rack.
And that's even after the pulses. That's still followed with the intense stretch.
And then you would then you move. Spend some time, get your wits about you, and then do a stretch thereafter.
Really, I'd heard the pulses, and I mean, I've read so much from Dante over the years, and I've seen the pulses recommended, or the partials, or the holds.
Right.
But I usually have seen it in the context of like, once you've been doing it for a long time, that's one more advanced thing, not like in his standard, 2-way split.
Yeah, Dante's even said, and this is where, this Dante's always got to defer to Dante because it's his training system. But he's like, if there's anything I would leave out, it would be that.
Yeah.
Like, don't worry about that so much. The thing you don't
that's
do.
Why he doesn't always mention it. I'm not
sure. It really is. And I always thought, he's like, he said it kind of gets you used to holding the weight.
Yeah.
But I would always tackle those on, and sometimes the time under tension, if you're thinking about it in that way, and the effort level is like literally, it's an all-out effort for maybe 15 seconds.
It's intense.
So it's like that. I'm holding this as hard as I can, like I'm fighting for my life.
Right.
Like you're struggling on that last failure rep, and most of that pulse or that partial effort after the 3rd failure point of the rest pause set is essentially a max effort. You're just trying to keep the thing from coming down on you. So that, depending on the person, some people would just be like, fuck it, I can't do anything. And it's the stretches are the same thing too. You can take those stretches and kind of like, push your way through them, or you can make them really, really difficult.
Yeah.
So,
but anyway, the point still being that, so when you go to his advanced, if you ever see him talk about the advanced method, he has people more on a 1 time per week frequency. And he says, so for example, your chest day might be first exercise, rest pause, just like we talked about. Second exercise, rest pause, just like we talked about. Third exercise, maybe like a straight set, maybe a 4th exercise straight set. And then maybe if you had like weak triceps, you do one like Widowmaker. I'm not going to get into all the details of that, but you know,
Right.
for like weak triceps. But the point being, he says that he doesn't think that these really advanced guys using these big poundages should be doing twice a week frequency for the most part, and yet he's throwing in this more volume into one session. And that would kind of go along with that theory of you need to create, as an advanced trainee, in a given session, you need to create more of a stimulus, but you're using such heavy weights that you need more time to recover. So he's actually saying essentially you want decreased frequency on the whole compared to when you were a noob. Would you agree with that?
Well, there's one thing that, and hopefully you'll like this notion because it's a scientifically based one, is that we have a selection bias potentially at play here. So in order to become a really big advanced guy, at the point where that type of principle would then apply, like we're going to take that approach, you probably have to have good enough genetics to get to become that big of a guy.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And the thing that we seem to see, if you look at the genetics studies and the studies have been done examining the characteristics of extreme responders versus those are moderate or maybe lower non-responders, is they tend to get an increase in the growth factors and the signaling molecules that turn on satellite cell activity. And from what I've been able to find so far, just one study in humans, that's a process that lasts about 5 to 7 days.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who are going to grow the best, the ones that are most likely to become the monsters, are the ones that can get a good satellite cell response from a singular workout. And that's a process that lasts about a week.
Yeah.
Something like that. The satellite cells, if you look at the literature as a whole, just looking at the responder literature, having a higher density of those in the first place and having a better response in terms of those over the course of a training study suggests someone's going to be a better responder. There's an association there. And if you take the myonuclear domain theory in mind and look at how big fibers can get, there's also some nuances there because a lot of big bodybuilders don't have big fibers necessarily. They just may have lots of them and lots of type 1s. Those are the volume type guys probably. But anyway, if you're turning on the satellite cell activity, and that's something that it's proceeding for about a week, then it would make sense to let that go through its process rather than disrupting the cell again with another training bout per se. Now, if you're someone who doesn't do that well, you may have to train more frequently,
right,
and to bump that process into motion. But in that case, if you're going to train more frequently, you're not going to be able to recover as well. And this is where some interesting work has been done. And we'll get back to Dante in a second. I'm not blowing that off. But Damas has done some cool studies. They did a frequency study where they looked at 2 versus 3 versus 5 times a week, training the quads. It was 3 sets per session. So there's a difference both in frequency and volume. So they didn't try to equate volume across all groups, but they had 3 different training frequencies. They found no difference in muscle growth when they looked at the averages.
Right.
Then they took a look at the individual responses, and they published a second paper. And you may have heard me talk about this one or seen it.
I saw recently you had graphs on your Instagram showing pretty dynamic differences in terms of high or low responders.
So what they were doing is I love this model. It's the one I used basically way back when for my dissertation. The subjects were training one leg with one frequency and the other leg with another frequency.
Yeah.
So as it turned out, they just grouped the 2 and 3 together. Those were pretty close, and the 5 together. And if you looked at individual responses and compared the higher frequency with the lower frequency, some people did better with the high frequency and not nearly as well with the low frequency. Some people did really well with both.
Yeah.
And some people did really poorly with both, and some people did better with low versus high or high versus low. It was all over the place.
Yeah.
So there's going to be some nuances there as to whether someone does better with higher or lower frequency, or maybe with higher or lower volume. The explanation I've kind of come up with is if you get a good response, maybe you need to continually sort of prime the pump, continually evoke a growth factor stimulus to get the satellite cell progression to happen so that you can have more nuclei and you can then enlarge the cells, because that's going to be something that's going to need to happen. You just can't grow these cells into giant cells and not have more nuclei. There's some expansion of the size of the cell can happen without nuclear addition, and there's various examples of that, maybe initially when starting off a program, but that seems to be something that kind of needs to happen. So that can also be a function of how well someone can recover. So I have some interesting thoughts there too. So some people, what you're talking about really is junk volume.
Yeah.
So some people, let's say they do, you compare 3 versus 6 versus 9 versus 12 sets. And for them, if they do 6 sets, they're going to need a week's worth of recovery. That's just it.
Yeah.
6 all-out sets, they're going to be blasted. I tend to get really sore from training. Probably I train decently hard, and I've just always been like that. I always say I've been sore for like 30 years now.
Right.
Well, actually, closer to 40.
Yeah.
I'm always sore if I'm training, and I've been pretty much training continuously. Some people don't get nearly as sore. John Meadows doesn't get nearly as sore.
Right.
It takes a lot for him to get sore. So that could be a function of a number of different things. There's actually looked at some single nucleotide polymorphisms, looking at IGF-2, for instance, some of the costameric proteins that are involved with muscle structure. So those are the things like what's actually happening with the sarcomeres in terms of being dismantled and disrupted, literally physically, from the high tensions that are evoked during the training session. So there's a bunch of things that probably, and I think IL-6 is actually involved as well.
Okay.
So the inflammatory response, literally mechanical disruption. IGF-2 is probably involved with the growth response as well, the recovery response in terms of turning on anabolism to repair. Those things have all not been worked out to my knowledge, but there's a nice paper that kind of covers the data looking at those. There's another aspect to it as well. So you've got the ability to recover from a given number of sets. And one thing that was really interesting, we had Brandon Curry on the podcast. And I'd always suggested this, and it sounds totally like a Ronnie Coleman type of thing.
Yeah.
He was talking about over in the Middle East when people come to Oxygen Gym, and like they just run them through the ringer. When new guys get there, they push them with just crazy volume.
Really?
That's the type of stuff. Yeah, they really go after it, and basically the guys that survive are the ones that can handle that volume.
Right.
They're the one, and the more you can train from and recover from, the more you're going to be able to grow. So
Sure.
Assuming recovery occurs regardless of training frequency, if you're someone who can train, all other things being equal, with 15 sets versus 6 sets, 15 sets is probably in your favor, as long as you can recover from it.
Right, right.
So,
and how are you gauging that? Just, how they feel, if they're making strength gains? How are you? Because I feel like there's quite a large range that I can recover from. But just as a real quick extreme example, I did a pull-up specialization phase, and I had gotten to the point that I was doing 30 sets of back per week.
Oof.
During that time, I was resting my pec. So I was doing 2 sets of incline dumbbell bench per week. And both my pull-ups and my dumbbell benches were going up at that time. So it's like, what the hell do I take from that,
Well, I think there can be some differences, in relative rates of muscle recovery.
Yeah.
Calves tend to be really resilient. There's also probably some epigenetic things that may go on too. Like I was a swimmer when I was a kid.
You know, like a swimmer.
What's that?
You were a wrestler too, right?
I wrestled for like 2 years, but that was like
Okay.
7th, 8th grade. But I started swimming when I was like 5 or 6.
Okay.
And I swam all the way through high school until my senior year. So I was captain of my swimming team.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, but swimming every summer, like swimming was my thing. A lot of back work and swimming. We did dry land work, but it's hardly any push-ups, that sort of thing. So my back is really resilient. I can do rack deads, and I'll still get pretty sore, but it grows much more easily. And that there are some epigenetic things that seem to happen, and we're finding out more and more about that. It's pretty cool, actually. Even the satellite cells, you could culture satellite cells from trained individuals and make that, and you will see differences in things like insulin sensitivity in those satellite cells that weren't even involved in any contraction. They were just outside the cell, so to speak, under the basal lamina, monitoring the activity levels. So there's things that are going on that may be involved there, and who knows what those are.
Do you think you were almost like primed for that because you did the swimming from such a young age? Whereas like if somebody started swimming at 30 for 10 years, their back might not have those same adaptations.
I think there probably is a developmental aspect to your ability to sort of incorporate epigenetic changes, because the body literally is mean, if you're talking about from age, let's say 5 to 15,
Mhm.
and I go from 65 pounds to 165 pounds,
Right.
there's all sorts of changes going on. The body is picking up on those things. There's some really interesting things. They've done this in animals now, and they've like the easiest model to study is when they sort of relatively starve or they limit food intake for mothers during pregnancy. And you can see they can look at various markers that are involved with metabolism and the methylation of genes, which basically impacts methylation, acetylation. There's some other things that are involved with these epigenetic changes that dictate the extent to which those genes can be turned on or not turned on. And when you look at the offspring of those mothers and even the offspring of those offspring, so like the grandkids, they will tend to have a more thrifty metabolism, hold on to
Right.
body fat.
I've heard that,
So these sorts of things can happen. And I always tell the story of a friend of mine. This wasn't muscle related, but it was strength related, and maybe the nervous system. It may not have anything to do with epigenetics, but she was ended up being a champion swimmer and tennis player, like a state champion, both sports when she was in high school. And her dad, she was kind of a little bit of a prodigy. Both of her parents were involved with elementary education, so they knew a lot about learning and sort of so she scored a perfect score on her SATs when she was like 14 or something.
Yeah.
Like double 800s. You never know talking to her. Very normal person, but like really a lot. They used to have her play math games on. She didn't get TV. She played this math game, on her computer.
Yeah.
And they started her bench pressing from the age of 6. So they go out for a run, do their cardiovascular work, and then they do some upper body strength. They had a flat bench in the garage. She'd do flat bench, and then they go and do whatever swimming or tennis, whatever it was they were training for at the time. She bench pressed from the age of 16, like all the way through high school. As she was growing and developing, I met her when she was in college. She'd go into the weight room, but she wasn't even doing anything, just exercising for fun, no competitive stuff. And she'd go into the weight room at the rec center in University of Georgia, and she'd lie down and she'd throw a couple of 45s on the bar and bang out a set of 10 to warm up, and then she'd go to 185, and then she'd train with 2.25.
Really?
And dudes would be running over, and she's weighing like 150, 160 at the time.
Jeez.
And guys are like running over and like, holy shit, they think that she doesn't know what she's got on the bar. She's not
Right.
or some guys would just say, well, I'm not going to bench when she's here.
Right.
She's making her look weak. She benched 285 in the gym one time, fucking around when she was a little bit intoxicated, which would have been a world record. It was completely raw. The time would have been raw. But the strength, she didn't have the same strength on an overhead press. She was reasonably strong when she trained, but it was very specific to that bench press.
Wow.
Because that's what she did. It was a neural specificity. So I suspect there's other things going on in terms of epigenetics that play a role. I sort of noticed that in myself.
Yeah.
So anyway, if we look back then to Dante's idea that you've got the biggest guys who now need to kind of specialize in that way, that makes sense. That makes sense for a couple reasons. One, those guys may be the ones that simply can get away with less frequent training to some degree because they get a better growth factor response, which is something that precedes. You see most of the best bodybuilders, pros, who immediately distance themselves from their peers, and then they train with kind of a bro split because they can. Yeah, and they're probably just more sensitive to the stimulus anyway.
Right. Well, I think that's interesting if you're talking about advanced, because a very common question is, well, how do you know if you're advanced? How do you know if you're intermediate? And I remember years ago, Candido, Johnny Candido, he's a really good powerlifter, and he put out a routine that I had done, and I liked it a lot. But he said that when he does programming for beginner, intermediate, or advanced, he only looks at your rate of progression, meaning if you're still at the point that you can progress every workout, you're a beginner. If you're maybe every week or every month, intermediate, and then advanced would be like past that. And I really like that definition because I think from a programming standpoint, that makes sense. So if anybody sees my physique and they see me next to a bodybuilder, I look like a beginner, right? Complete beginner. But after 15 years, I do need advanced level programming to have any progress in like strength gains. I actually this year hit a overhead press PR, and I was able to get 225, which for me, at what was I? Probably just under 200 pounds. And, in today's standards, that's like nothing. But to me, that was like pretty good. But it took some programming and, some specialization for that. And that's where I think that makes sense. However, I will say that like when you look at, Dante talked about these advanced guys, there's also something to be said for how much damage is this doing to your body. And the reality is, I never squatted much over 400 pounds.
Mm.
Even if I've been lifting for 15 years, that is probably not doing as much to my body as somebody with great lifting genetics who's squatting 600 pounds within 5 years. That there is something to be said for the absolute weight and what it does to your joints, your tendons, and things like that. And so I think, are you truly advanced in the sense of how you want to set up your splits and everything if you're not actually this huge guy lifting a lot of weights, and that's where maybe guys on gear are even more susceptible to that, because they are really, their muscle mass may be beyond what their, skeletal structure is able to support at times, which is maybe one of the reasons that we see more injuries among enhanced lifters.
Yeah, you said a lot there. So yeah, I totally agree with you. Like if your law of diminishing returns and your genetics means that you're 225 is near the best you're ever going to get for an overhead press. That's not going to be elite level. I mean, there are guys who do 315 for sets of 10 or what have you. But for you, you're getting there. So you need to start like pulling out trump cards, using the specialized training cycles as you have been to try to get anything more from you. The one thing too, I think that does play a role is how much food you're willing to eat, how much bigger you're willing to get. I mean, if we hypnotize you, speaking of, which we talked about, I think before we recorded, we hypnotize you and said, you need to be 275 pounds in 3 years, and your appetite is always on, we can literally like one of those classical hypnosis things around the stage and just eating food like crazy and until you're about ready to burst. You would be stronger, obviously, if you got to 250 or 275. That's true for a lot of that. I think holds back a lot of bodybuilders too. Is just the willingness to get and the ability. Like there's genetics too to how much you can eat. Some people have tremendous appetites.
Yeah,
I've known some guys who you can especially see it after a show, and they just start putting down the food, and they'll put on 50 pounds in 3 months, and they get they look really bad and sloppy and nasty afterwards, but they just have big appetites.
Yeah.
So so the thing is, and this is where this DAMA study, which was I think it was with untrained individuals, where they showed this diversity of responses to the high versus the low training frequencies, which was also high and low training volume. So hopefully they'll do a follow-up and sort of try to split that out a little bit more. Is that for the people that we consider to be most advanced, and this is why you bring up a really good point, we consider advanced to be elite.
Right.
But you can be advanced and be average, so to speak, in the grand scheme of things. Right, exactly. This is why it's like I've told you this before, Dave. This is great to have you here because because you're doing this podcast.
Genetics, yeah.
Well, but you represent more like the midline, the median of people who are going to run up against this, and if you listen to pick, I'm not going to say any names, but pick some top pro. You don't have a lot of. John Meadows is an extraordinary example of an awesome, tremendous physique, pro caliber physique, badass, who also has done a lot of experimentation. He's educated himself. He's taken on a really intellectual approach to it. But if you got a really good physique like that, or in many cases, most of the best bodybuilders, they didn't need to do any of those things to get their physique because they had the genetic proclivity for it.
Right.
So,
and even John, I would say, this is nothing against John because I like John a lot. But you will find probably the best example of this is a guy like Ben Pekulski, where somehow, as a previous top 10 Olympian, will literally say that he has terrible genetics. And I mean, I've heard him say that, and it's mind-boggling to me that everybody who's not the number one in the world talks about how much harder they had to work. It's just unbelievable. I remember Kai Green was like, Phil Heath, you can keep your gifts. I'm like, Kai, do you have any idea? But anyway, but I would just say even a guy like John, I think John structurally doesn't maybe have the best genetics. But he's talked about how when he was in high school, I think he was squatting over 500 pounds. He had an 18-inch neck, 18-inch calves. I mean, John definitely has great genetics compared to the average person. Maybe not compared to elite bodybuilders, but just for context for people listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's the thing, though. So if you look at that DAMA study where some people did better, at least initially, not talking about as they're nearing their genetic potential, but some of them did better with a lower frequency, lower volume versus a higher frequency, higher volume approach. if we just take that for what it is in a very basic way, it does it, and we say, like, compare you with the person that Dante would typically be talking about, who's already like competed at the national level. They've almost gotten their pro card. You're a different person, genetically speaking, than that person is, right? I mean, there's something otherwise you would be as big as they are. Dave, you would probably be one of the biggest guys on the planet, because I know you put everything into this in so many ways. Like, your effort level has not been superseded by anyone I can think of. So it may be that instead of taking that approach of moving to all like once a week and doing higher volume, maybe you can't recover from that. I have the sense that if I tried to train with that much volume on a given day, I would just be so sore that I don't know if I'd be able to make it back a week later. Who knows? Maybe I would. I haven't given that a shot per se, but there does seem to be some differences in how much frequency, how much volume people will need. And I think of this in a grand scheme along the hormesis sort of principle, that there's a stimulus response, and you get to some sort of optimal stimulus and adaptation, and then you go beyond that. And then now a lot of your recovery resources are going just to getting back to baseline, not in making forward progress. You keep going too far in the stimulus, and eventually you get into an overtraining phenomenon. And they see that in for instance, the muscle protein synthesis literature, that they finally sort of figured out. There are several studies that we're finding when you measure the protein synthetic response at the beginning of a training period, that it doesn't correlate at all with the eventual growth that's brought on by that training. Mm. And so it's actually Damas again. They did this study. They waited about 3 weeks past that period of muscle soreness that starts. So they allowed that repeated bout effect to take place. And they measured at the beginning, they measured about 3 weeks in, and they measured at the end, and they also measured muscle growth through the course. And about 3 weeks in, you found really good correlations between the protein synthetic response from a single bout and the eventual growth that you got over the course of the training period. But if you measure right off the bat, there was no correlation. It was literally, we're talking correlations of like 0.01. Like there's nothing. Wow. And that and they sort of attribute that you've got a lot of your resources, your protein synthetic resources, are going to recovery, to basically how much are you just basically piecing the muscle cells back together after the disruption that's been caused. So what's going on there? So much of the protein synthesis is simply recovering from the insult or the injury, that it's no longer reflective of what is going to happen down the road when that synthesis, when those things have sort of been taken care of. And now the synthesis is a response to the stimulus of the training per se, as an adaptive stimulus for muscle growth or hypertrophy. So some people are going to have lots of muscle damage. They're going to have a lot of their protein synthesis going towards recovery. That tends to be me. I tend to be sore really easily. So in that case, being sore all the time, like you are if you just start off a new program, is probably not the best thing for you.
Right.
That seems to be associated with, okay, now I'm using up my protein synthetic resources, just trying to clean up the disruption that I've caused, as opposed to getting in, creating the stimulus, knowing that any small amount of volume for me is going to create more disruption than maybe even the average person. Or maybe it's a function of the weights that I'm using and how hard I've learned how to train. And the fact that if I'm going to continue to evoke more an actual stimulus, I've got that smaller window for effective reps, which we talked about. So in order for me to evoke the stimulus, I have to train really friggin' hard. But because I'm not gifted in terms of, I just have an overactive inflammatory response or something about the costameric structural proteins, they get disrupted more easily. Just not gifted in the recovery in terms of getting past that insult, or not actually having the primary insult where the contractile proteins and the sarcomeres become disaligned.
Yeah.
I can't get away with doing more stimulus because I just end up having so much disruption that I can only do 1 or 2 sets.
Right.
But I have to train so hard.
Right.
I've got this catch-22 in order to get a real stimulus, that I get so much damage. So for me, there's my limitation. So let's say I can do 2 sets and all out failure, and then that's all. I'll have so much disruption. If I went beyond that, I would just eat up my protein synthetic resources. but those have to be hard enough. So I get 2 effective reps per workout. If we want to think about that.
Right.
Now think about someone else who's got better genetics, like maybe John, which we talked about John. John doesn't get sore nearly as easily. So whatever is involved with just using up that protein synthesis for repair and restoration of the ultrastructure of the cells, John doesn't have that inflammatory response. He's lucky in that he doesn't get sore. So now John can do 5 sets.
Right.
And get 5 effective reps, let's say, all other things being equal. So now John can do like over twice the volume I can, evoke twice the stimulus that I can, and still recover, so to speak, so that he can train hard again and not constantly be repairing because there's soreness and damage. So if we look back then at maybe this idea with Dante, that for many people, the most gifted ones who are, or maybe don't get quite as sore and get away with higher volume, who have a great growth factor response, as opposed to those who don't grow as well, they may be able to do higher volumes because they can recover from that. It's not just creating this massive inflammatory protein synthesis eating up incident.
Right.
And the other thing that's important there, and I'm not trying to that works for many people. Plus, it's just different.
Yeah,
if you've been doing higher frequency, it's just different. There can be something to say for that. The other thing with people who, and this was maybe one of the questions you wanted to cover, is if you can do more exercises,
right,
you're going to get different activation patterns. And there may be, for whatever reason, even if you go all out on squats, for instance, there may be certain muscles of the quad. There's actually a study that's demonstrated this.
Different areas. And let me just give a brief primer too, because you're right, this is one of the questions that I had.